What makes this entire situation so painful to watch isn't just the legal confusion or the money disputes. It's the slow, visible collapse of trust between people who once called themselves family. When you listen carefully to Kody talk about Coyote Pass, you don't just hear contradictions. You hear fear, resentment, manipulation, and a desperate attempt to rewrite history in a way that makes him look less responsible for the damage left behind. At first, Kody paints himself as someone cornered. He claims he was being pushed, that he had no real power, that decisions were being forced onto him by circumstances and by Janelle. According to this version, he's almost a victim of pressure, someone stuck between women who couldn't agree, forced to choose sides. But the more he talks, the more that image falls apart. Because in another version of the same story, he admits something far darker. He acknowledges that the idea of selling the property without full consent crossed his mind. He admits there was a moment, even if he now downplays it, where doing something underhanded felt tempting. And that admission matters, because it reveals that the chaos wasn't just external. It was internal. The urge to hurt, to retaliate, to win something after years of loss had already taken root. Meri's experience, by contrast, feels heartbreakingly consistent. From the beginning, she describes discovering that the land had been divided and discussed without her knowledge. She wasn't part of the conversation. She didn't get a vote. And when she finally became aware of what was happening, she wasn't invited into a discussion. She was presented with a near-finished decision and pressured to agree. That kind of moment doesn't just sting. It shatters whatever sense of belonging might still exist. Imagine realizing that people you trusted were making decisions about your future behind closed doors. Imagine finding out not because someone respected you enough to include you, but because the truth finally leaked out. That's not just about land or money. That's about dignity. And yet, even after that betrayal, Meri did what people are often advised to do when trust is gone. She removed herself emotionally and let her lawyer speak. That choice wasn't cold or calculated. It was self-preservation. When communication breaks down to the point where every conversation can be twisted later, silence through legal representation becomes the only safe option. Kody later uses that silence against her. He frames it as distance, as hostility, as proof that she was already an enemy. But in reality, it was a boundary, one she was told to create in order to protect herself. Janelle's role is where the emotional complexity deepens. She didn't present herself as an enemy. She didn't openly declare sides. Instead, she hovered in the middle. And that's often the most dangerous place to stand. Whether her intentions were peaceful or strategic, the outcome was the same: mistrust multiplied. On the surface, it looks like Janelle was trying to move things along. She wanted resolution. She wanted the sale completed. She wanted closure. But beneath that practical urgency was something heavier: grief, exhaustion, and fear about the future. She was dealing with immense personal loss, trying to manage her own financial survival, and staring down the reality that, unlike a legal spouse, she didn't have strong protections. That kind of pressure changes how people behave. It makes them impatient. It makes them take shortcuts. It makes them justify conversations they probably shouldn't be having. The problem wasn't that Janelle wanted the property sold. The problem was how it was handled. Talking privately with Kody while lawyers were supposedly involved created a dangerous gray area. One where memories blur, intentions are questioned, and narratives become weapons later. Meri sensed this shift long before it was confirmed. She noticed conversations going quiet. She noticed that information wasn't being shared. She felt decisions happening somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't invited. And when someone suggested she simply ask Janelle directly, her response said everything about the history between them. She didn't believe honesty would come from that conversation. That kind of mistrust doesn't appear overnight. It's built over years of alliances, betrayals, and quiet power struggles. In families like this, decisions aren't always made openly. They're negotiated in fragments, through side conversations and shifting loyalties. Kody himself admits this dynamic when he talks about how divorce affected him. He doesn't deny that something dark grew inside him. He describes feeling hardened, less compassionate, more willing to consider actions he once might have rejected. And instead of confronting that truth fully, He now seems to distance himself from it by blaming the influence of others. One moment, he says Janelle pressured him. Another moment, he says it was never his idea at all. Then he admits he considered it briefly. Each retelling reshapes responsibility just enough to keep him from holding it entirely. What's especially painful is how easily he rationalizes betrayal. In his mind, because he and Meri were already in conflict, because lawyers were involved, because he wasn't pretending to protect her interests, harming her would somehow be acceptable. As if honesty about hostility makes cruelty less cruel. That logic reveals more about his emotional state than he probably realizes. Janelle, meanwhile, becomes an easy target in this narrative. She's painted as someone pulling strings, playing both sides, pushing others to act while keeping her hands clean. But that version ignores how vulnerable her position actually was. She needed money. She needed stability. She needed to move forward. And in a system that rarely protected her, survival likely felt more urgent than loyalty. Still, intentions don't erase consequences. By having conversations without full transparency, by stepping into a mediator role she wasn't equipped to hold, Janelle unintentionally created space for manipulation. Without documented communication, without legal witnesses, the truth became malleable. And Kody took full advantage of that flexibility. The most telling detail is how often these crucial conversations supposedly happened off camera. That absence of record makes it impossible to know exactly who said what. And that uncertainty benefits the person most willing to reshape the story afterward. Meri, in contrast, stayed consistent. She trusted the process, even when it didn't give her everything she deserved. Without legal help, it's likely she would have walked away with nothing. Even with it, she still didn't receive a share that fully reflected her contributions. But at least there was accountability. The deeper tragedy here isn't just the land dispute. It's the realization that none of them felt safe enough to be fully honest with each other. Every interaction was filtered through fear, strategy, and past wounds. Every decision felt like a battle instead of a conversation. And that's what this story ultimately exposes. A family structure that taught people to compete instead of cooperate, to form alliances instead of trust, and to protect themselves even when it meant hurting someone else. Kody now stands at the center of that wreckage, blaming one person today, another tomorrow, while the truth sits somewhere in between, fractured, emotional, and unresolved. This isn't just about who betrayed whom. It's about how years of imbalance, favoritism, and emotional neglect. As Kody continues explaining himself, the emotional mask slips even further. He no longer sounds like someone caught in the middle. He sounds like someone justifying harm by reframing it as inevitability. When he talks about already being at war with Meri, what he's really saying is that, in his mind, basic moral limits no longer applied. Once someone was labeled an opponent, anything done to them could be rationalized. That mindset is dangerous, especially in a family structure where power was never evenly distributed to begin with. When one person decides they're allowed to hurt others simply because the relationship is broken, trust doesn't just collapse, it's obliterated. What makes this even more disturbing is how casually he discusses the idea of selling the property without full consent and paying later, as if fairness can always be retroactively applied. That way of thinking strips people of agency. It assumes damage can always be repaired with money, and that emotional betrayal is secondary, almost irrelevant. But betrayal doesn't work that way. Once it happens, no explanation ever truly cleans it up. Janelle, at this stage, is being described as both a co-conspirator and a victim, depending on which version Kody needs in the moment. Sometimes she's the instigator. Other times she's just someone agreeing with him. Then suddenly she's pressuring him, manipulating him, pushing him into decisions he didn't want to make. Each version contradicts the last, but they all share one thing in common. Kody is never the central decision maker. Yet everything about his role suggests otherwise. He was the one with authority. He was the one people deferred to. He was the one whose approval ultimately mattered. And pretending otherwise now feels less like confusion and more like avoidance. Janelle's situation deserves empathy, but not romanticizing. She was grieving deeply, overwhelmed emotionally, and under financial strain. Anyone in that position would want resolution as quickly as possible. Wanting the sale done, wanting to move on, wanting money to start over. None of that makes her cruel. It makes her exhausted. But exhaustion doesn't justify secrecy. And secrecy is what poisoned everything. If she truly believed she and Meri were working together, then having private conversations with Kody was a breach of trust. And if she never truly saw Meri as an equal partner, then the friendship she presented on camera becomes something far more uncomfortable, a performance shaped by necessity rather than sincerity. From Meri's perspective, this is where the deepest wound forms. It's not just that decisions were made without her. It's that she believed, at least for a moment, that she wasn't alone. That there was a shared front. That someone else understood how vulnerable she was in this process. Finding out that conversations were happening elsewhere would feel less like a misunderstanding and more like confirmation of her worst fears. That loyalty in this family was always conditional. And that's why her distrust feels justified. Not dramatic. Not paranoid. Just painfully realistic. Kody tries to dismiss this by framing Meri as someone who was already out, already distant, already hostile. But distance doesn't erase rights. And legal boundaries don't cancel emotional responsibility. In fact, the need for lawyers usually means responsibility should increase, not disappear. What stands out most is how often Kody equates honesty with intention. In his mind, because he wasn't pretending to protect Meri, he wasn't betraying her. But betrayal isn't defined by intention, it's defined by impact. And the impact here was devastating. Meanwhile, Janelle is described as someone who always knew how to survive within this system. Building alliances. Choosing moments carefully. Aligning where necessary. Those habits weren't created out of malice, they were learned. In a family where resources were limited and attention was uneven, strategy became survival. That doesn't make her innocent, but it does make her understandable. The real tragedy is that this system forced everyone into roles where honesty became risky. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could cost you security. So people learned to speak differently depending on who was listening. Over time, truth became fragmented. Kody benefited from that fragmentation the most. Every time the story shifts, every time blame moves, every time responsibility blurs, he gains distance from accountability. And the more distance he gains, the easier it becomes to frame himself as misunderstood rather than culpable. What's especially telling is how little acknowledgement there is of Meri's emotional loss. Not just financial. Emotional. Being excluded, distrusted, talked around, and then blamed for reacting to it. Her pain is treated as an inconvenience instead of a consequence. And yet, without legal intervention, she likely would have lost even more. That fact alone speaks volumes. It suggests that fairness was never going to happen organically. It had to be forced. The uncomfortable truth is that none of these relationships were built to survive conflict. They were built to survive control. And once control fractured, everything else followed. Janelle may still be emotionally tethered to Kody in ways she hasn't fully untangled. That bond makes her vulnerable to influence, to persuasion, to hope that cooperation might still be rewarded. Meri, by contrast, has stepped further away emotionally, creating boundaries that look cold but are actually protective. Kody exists somewhere in between, unwilling to fully let go, but equally unwilling to accept responsibility. That limbo is where manipulation thrives. And as long as he remains part of the equation, real healing feels impossible. Every interaction becomes a negotiation. Every memory becomes revisionist. Every conflict becomes someone else's fault. So when he places the blame entirely on Janelle now, it rings hollow. She wasn't the only one making choices. She wasn't the only one with motives. And she certainly wasn't the only one capable of causing harm. Meri ends up being the quiet casualty of all of it, not because she didn't fight, but because she fought the only way she safely could. This isn't a story with a clean villain or a clear hero. It's a story about what happens when a system rewards manipulation, punishes vulnerability, and leaves people scrambling to protect themselves at any cost. And that's why viewers feel unsettled. Because beneath the legal arguments and shifting narratives, there's a deeper truth that can't be ignored. This family didn't fall apart because of one bad decision. It fell apart because trust was slowly traded for strategy, honesty for survival, and love for control. And once that happens, No amount of rewriting the story can undo the damage. That's the part that still lingers, and probably always will.